Hello. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, more technical problems, but that's not an issue. I managed to fix it. Well, hello, and hello to everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the first edition. We have a very special guest with us tonight, so let's go ahead and get started, shall we? And we're back with the first edition. I am your humble host, the Literature Devil, and tonight I have with us published author, evil genius, and flawless specimen of toxic masculinity, Matthew Kadish. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
The main reason why I had you on tonight is because your article here called Storycraft, Is It Wrong or Sexist to Think that Ray is a Mary Sue? And I read through your article. I found it excellently written. Very good analysis. Excellent analysis. Let's
Thank
see.
you.
And I think it's very pertinent, a very important question to ask, even though it's kind of a weird one to ask because, it kind of really shouldn't be a bad thing to call a Mary Sue-ish character a Mary Sue. But, in this kind of a culture, this kind of culture climate, it's something that's almost rebellious action to criticize a character who has been deemed untouchable by the mass media.
Yeah, what's interesting is I think because it's like such a well-known female term, Mary Sue, in terms of like that's the label that's given to these types of characters, that people kind of just naturally assume that, oh, it's targeted just to women. But it's a term that has a masculine and feminine form. So, like the male version of a Mary Sue is called a Gary Stew, for instance. So, when we're talking about the type of characters that embody this in a female character, and we refer to her as a Mary Sue, that's kind of like a dog whistle, I guess you'd call it, for more sensitive, kind of politically correct people to say, like, oh, well, that's singling out women and this is criticizing women, and therefore that means that you have an agenda against women, and therefore you must be sexist if you're using this term.
Right, and I think you mentioned this in your article that Mary Sue, the term Mary Sue anyway, isn't really a gender-specific term since it's pretty much grown into the generic title for these sorts of characters. It's more like a general term, kind of like how we use the term guys. It doesn't really mean a group of just men. It can mean men and women.
Well, the initial term for this type of character was called a self-insert,
Mhm.
and it's basically something that inexperienced writers or not very good writers would do, where they would basically create main characters that they would uh, use as stand-ins for themselves within the story. And because they were kind of projecting how they would want to be within their made-up world, they would make themselves like perfect, and they would just do everything heroic and everything they needed to, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until that there was this Star Trek fan fiction that this woman had written, where the main character of her story was called Mary Sue, and it became kind of a shorthand for the self-insert character in genre fiction. So like the people who were kind of the writer wonks, the people who write a lot and told stories and stuff like that, kind of just started using the term Mary Sue because it was, just something that was easier to remember and a little bit less awkward to say than self-insert. So that was kind of like the origin of this term. And even though it did start with the female tense of the word, it can easily apply to male characters as well, but they just call it a Gary Stew type character instead of the Mary Sue. But they're both kind of under the umbrella of this term called self-insert.
Right. I think the term Mary Sue is. I'm pretty sure everyone knows that the term Mary Sue means both men and or male and female characters. I think it's been adopted into just an attack on female characters as a sort of way to fit their agenda. I think you also described this in your article later on that it's used to make certain female characters untouchable because, and then this is one thing I really liked about your article is that you managed to point out something that I hadn't really seen before. I knew about you mentioned that the Mary Sue's character, people like it because they're basically a pair of pants. You know, anyone can read them. You put them on, and you just basically insert yourself into that role. And a lot of people don't like seeing criticism of that character, mainly because any criticism towards that character they kind of see as criticism towards themselves because they want to be that character. And so it's become easy and convenient for them to take the term Mary Sue, which has been understood to mean just any character who's ridiculously written, and just attach it to any female character that they, especially one they don't want touched in a critical way.
Yeah, there's a psychological issue at play here, and this is something that, like, as a writer, if you're studying how to, connect to your audience and stuff like that, you kind of understand this concept. But when it comes to visual mediums like movies, TV shows, stuff like that, you have this concept of character identification, which is basically like, as an audience member, you come to like and identify with a certain character, and you begin to kind of project qualities of yourself into that character, or see qualities in that character that you like and you want to absorb into yourself. And there's two types of kind of like visual audience members. There's like the critical audience member, who's able to kind of like watch movies and TV shows critically, kind of break them down, follow the plot logic, stuff like that. And then you have kind of like the other side of that coin, where you have audience members who basically they turn off their brains, they turn off their critical factor while they're watching something,
Right.
and they just kind of go along with it. It doesn't matter how stupid or how bad the story might be. Their critical factor doesn't kick in at all, and so they just kind of go along with with the story. And those are the people, the segment of the audience that kind of more easily latch on to these characters, even though they're incredibly flawed. And so once that segment of the audience kind of identifies with the character, if you start criticizing the character that they like, or the show that they like, or whatever, they kind of take that as a personal insult or a personal attack on them because they've identified so strongly with the character. And so they begin attacking back. And oftentimes, these attacks will either come, in terms of like personal criticism against the person who's criticizing the character or the story, or they will try to find ways to vilify the critic in order to negate their criticism. So, for instance, calling someone critical of the character of Ray a sexist is kind of like a very short and easy way of negating the criticism of the character. And so you see that basically happen a lot with the people who have come to kind of latch on to the character of Ray.
That is something I've seen recently, because at the end of the article you do kind of break everything down. Everything is broken down. Kind of, you come to the conclusion that yeah, Ray is a Mary Sue. It's kind of I mean, a lot of people have come to that conclusion, but you broke it down to that it's factual, it's logical, and it's as you stated in your opening paragraph of your opening of your article, it's dispassionate. It's more of it's not supposed to be a work of hate or a work of malice. It's just you're just looking at it with a critical eye and checking out. You name your own definition of a Mary Sue, and then you lay down some criteria of which the Mary Sue has to meet, or the character has to meet, to see whether or not she's a Mary Sue or not. And you actually do come to the conclusion at the very end that yeah, she meets all the criteria of a Mary Sue. And one thing I have noticed in modern culture, as movies and TV shows and sorts of things progress, is that usually when the character is badly written, as you have strong characters or well written characters, and weak characters are not so well written characters, that when the character is a weak character, like kind of like as you say, Bella Swan, no, not Bella Swan, it's from something else, but the main character from Twilight. You say the main character from Twilight, and then such other characters like Ray, that they are weak characters, poorly written characters, and usually you see this Mary Sue defense, that your sexist defense, your racist defense against characters like these, because everyone is going to come after them, but a certain percentage of the population, or the population of the audience, like them simply because they, like you said, they can identify, or they can use these characters for their own power fantasy, regardless of them taking, what they do with the story.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that, like, someone like me, I'm a little bit of an, I guess you'd call myself a little bit of an egghead academic type, but I'm a professional writer, and I grew up studying this stuff. My mother was an English teacher. I read a lot when I was a kid growing up. I watched a lot of movies. I went to film school. I studied film writing, screenplay writing. I actually worked in Hollywood as a screenplay writer for a little bit. I'm a professional novelist. I've gone to seminars on writing. I've gone to classes on writing. When I was in college, I went to creative writing classes and so on and so forth. So I've put in a lot of kind of actual academic study into plot and character and narrative and things of that nature that I'd say probably 95% of the people who consume media probably don't even bother with. Like it's kind of like, I don't know if it's art, but I know what I like type
Mm-hmm.
thing. And so, most people, they can go to a movie, or they can watch a TV show, or they can read a book, and they'll just kind of inherently know if there's something in there that feels right or feels wrong or what have you, but they won't really think about it. Whereas people like me, who are part of like the critical audience and are also, kind of practitioners of the discipline of writing, and a student of the art and things of that nature, I can sit there and I can be like, okay, well, I'm not just calling Ray a Mary Sue. Here are the criteria that a typical Mary Sue character meets. And here are examples of Ray, the character, meeting that criteria. And so, like, when you look at it from an academic perspective, I feel like you can objectively prove that this character was a poorly written self-insert character, as opposed to just like, hey, that's my opinion, man. I didn't like this character. So, I've been trying to write a series of articles called Storycraft, where basically I take like these kind of objectively proven narrative concepts and apply them to different movies, and show, like, what does a movie do right, and why was it right, and what does a movie do wrong, and why is it wrong. Not even a movie, but like a story, basically. Like it could be a TV show, a book, or whatever. It just so happens most people like consume movies very easily, so it's easier to kind of pinpoint that stuff. And in the case of the movie The Last Jedi, there were just so many examples of really bad writing that needed
Oh
to be
yeah.
called out. And a lot before I had written any of these articles, a lot of the times people, like, they would criticize The Last Jedi, but they wouldn't know how to really back up their criticism. They would just say, like, like, oh, I didn't like it, so it was bad, or it wasn't congruent with the other movies, so it was bad. But I was like, well, if we really sit down and analyze this stuff from a tradecraft perspective, from the perspective of another writer who actually kind of knows the concepts and can, like, analyze this stuff with a critical eye, in the most kind of neutral way possible, we can prove that this stuff, from at least a tradecraft perspective, from the perspective of someone who, you know, writes professionally, or studies writing or something like that, we can point to this stuff as, there are objective errors here, and this is why these things are bad, or these are why these things don't work. And the purpose of my articles is really just to educate people who maybe want to be writers or want to be professional critics or something along that nature, where they can kind of get exposed to these concepts and start applying them to other movies and start understanding them, and kind of, disseminating them through, like, critical culture and stuff like that. So that was kind of the point here. But yeah, the whole concept of a Mary Sue, of a self-insert character, there are specific definitions that go into, that character falling into that category. So someone could read my article and say, "Oh, I think it's BS," and then you can say, like, "Well, what do you think is BS?" And they can say, "Well, I think this is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong." I'm like, "Okay, can you refer to a verified source as to why this other verified source is wrong, other than your own opinion. And they never can do it. They can never say, like, oh, this concept that you laid out as to why this character is a Mary Sue, or as to why this plot point is bad, or what have you, is wrong. And, it's just impossible for them because it's based in objective standards of tradecraft.
Right, and that one thing that does that what your definition brings up, or at least to my mind, is that whole saying that you don't need to be a chef to know that the food is bad, and it's really telling in these cases that we're in such cases as Ray. I mean, the most of the population, most of the audience could figure out that there's something wrong here, that she's a Mary Sue character, and they might not be able to know why, like you said, but they do know, they can sense that there's something is a little off here. And in your article, you broke it down into pieces, into little sections, and you explained it bit by bit. And then when someone comes at you and saying that, well, this, I think you're wrong here, it's kind of a trade-off where you've shown your work, you've gone through the whole thing of showing your work, and you've explained why exactly you have come to the conclusion that she's a Mary Sue, but then all they have is emotion. All they have is, well, I don't think she's a Mary Sue because I like her. And as you proved in your article, she's a likable character to some degree. But that's basically your conundrum here, where all these people who really like these sorts of characters, especially in this sort of cultural climate, tend to guard them or block them with things like sexist and racist or what have you, so whatever it is they choose. And then when you go in and give it a critical eye and then break it down dispassionately, and all they have left is those bogus defenses, and they can never ever show their work because they're wrong. Most of the time, I mean, you might get someone every once in a while who brings up these other things like, oh, she's not a Mary Sue because she's flawed. But you also cover that in your analysis, that flaws, just because she has quote unquote flaws, doesn't mean they're actual flaws. Do you want to speak a little bit on that portion for a bit?
Yeah, I mean, this concept that just because a character has quote unquote flaws doesn't mean that they're actually not a perfect idealized character. And that's kind of the fundamental definition of a Mary Sue, as a character that is idealized and perfect. And in like what we call perfect, it kind of ranges on a broad spectrum of that definition, in the sense that they're perfect in the sense, like, for instance, a lot of these Mary Sue characters, they're very attractive girls, but they think that they're like a 5 out of 10 or whatever. And yet every guy in their atmosphere is kind of like falling all over themselves to be with her or to help her out, or what have you. Um, so like that's an example of someone who thinks that they're flawed, and in reality, they're perfect. Another example of this, for instance, in 50 Shades of Grey, uh, the author E.L. James tries to make Anastasia Steele seem like she's not perfect by making her clumsy. Like, she literally trips over her own 2 feet constantly.
That's a common one. That's a common one with Mary Sue, is giving him the clumsy trait.
Yeah. And so the idea of having a flawed character is that the character's flaw actually contributes to their overall struggle within the narrative that their character arc is a part of. So like that struggle that they're trying to overcome is a part of their character's transformation, their character arc, from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. So for instance, like an example of this might be the movie Leaving Las Vegas. This is just off the top of my head, but in that movie you have Nicolas Cage, who's an alcoholic, and he goes to Las Vegas to basically drink himself to death, commit suicide via alcohol. And he hires this hooker to kind of like babysit him and be with him as he does this. And over the course of the movie, they kind of fall in love. But at the end of the film, he still, kind of kills himself via alcohol. Sorry for spoilers. But his internal struggle, his major flaw, is that he's an alcoholic. And ultimately, he doesn't overcome that struggle, but that this alcoholism kind of defines his character and his character's struggle throughout the movie. Now, I want to ask you, like, can you name any flaw of Rey's that prevents her or that she has to struggle against in order to achieve her character arc in the movie, The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi?
Not a single one. All her observable quote unquote flaws are just window dressings. In my opinion, flaws are things, or real flaws, like ones that really define the character, as you mentioned, are flaws that keep them from having what they want. These are flaws that affect the plot, affect characterization. I mean, if she stumbles over a coin, stumbles over a tree limb or something, that's not really affecting the story. Yeah, she falls down, might be funny, but it's not a flaw. It's not going to affect her for stop her completely from destroying the First Order, destroying her enemies, achieving her goals. It's like I said, it's just window dressing with Ray. There are no real flaws there.
Yeah, I mean, like Rey's biggest kind of character journey, I'd argue, is that she's searching for a family. That's kind of like her quest because when we first see her in The Force Awakens, they make a very big point to show that she is isolated, that she's alone, that she's by herself. And throughout the course of The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, she kind of comes to assemble this surrogate family around her, something that she's never had before. But the thing is that there's no struggle to that. These surrogate family members come to her and latch onto her because they like her or she's so magnetic that they can't help but like her or whatever. She never has to win them over. She never has to overcome any type of prejudice or disbelief or anything like that. And her major thing is like she wants to stay on Jakku to wait for her parents to return because she's so desperate to have that familial connection, And that was one of the reasons why she mourned so much over Han Solo's death. And, I think probably one of the reasons why she wanted to attempt to help Kylo Ren was because she's kind of looking for some type of like family connection here. And even though it was very poorly handled, her Skype or Force Skype sessions with Kylo kind of created a bond there. Not necessarily romantic, but something where it's like, hey, this is someone that I identify with in some way. I think I can help them, that type of thing. But none of her stuff on this journey to assemble a surrogate family is ever earned. She never has to work for it. It's always either handed to her by the plot or it's derivative from the other characters just because it's like, oh, she's Rey, so they have to like her.
Yeah, that is another symptom of a Mary Sue. She's just handed everything. She doesn't have to struggle for pretty much anything. The I think the one thing I like to point out about the at least the Force Awakens, and one thing people always throw back at me when I say that she's a Mary Sue, is that one scene, her very first major fight with Kylo Ren, the one where they're in the forest and the snow, and Kylo Ren he's wounded and hurt, and he's running around with his lightsaber, and then she eventually beats him in a lightsaber duel. And I say that most people throw that and say, look, Kylo was hurt, and she's fully charged or fully she's in full peak condition more or less, so it makes sense that she would win. But I would say that she's story wise she's not supposed to win here. I mean, wouldn't it be a much stronger narrative if Kylo Ren is wounded on the brink of death, he's been shot, he's struggling to stay standing, and he still beats her without breaking a sweat? I mean, that would give a goal for her to reach, and it would be ambiguous as to how far that goal is because he was wounded, but still beat her with hardly any trouble.
Well, the biggest issue with The Force Awakens, and in particular that final lightsaber battle, I will say this. The final lightsaber battle between Rey and Kylo Ren, I felt was very cinematic, very well shot,
Oh yeah,
exciting to watch.
it
But the
was.
problem that J.J. Abrams and Ryan Johnson continued this with his movie is that they use the Force as a deus ex machina. And what that means is basically it's Latin for ghost from the machine. And
Mhm.
it's a term that is used in writing to describe a situation where when characters are in a position where the writer doesn't know how to get them out of, they just throw in this random thing that was never previously set up to come in and save the day. A ghost literally comes from the machine, and kind of, the gods come down from their heavens and kind of fix things for the hero, and then they leave. That type of thing. It was a term that was basically derived from Greek plays. And so in The Force Awakens, J.J. Abrams kind of set up this idea that the Force is kind of its own sentient thing, and that it automatically kind of balances out the light side with the dark side. And so he basically created this scenario where the Force is basically the answer to all the protagonist's problems. So when Rey is captured, she automatically knows how to do the Jedi mind trick, even though she's never had any training in it. She somehow knows how to channel the Force while fighting with a lightsaber against a trained Force user, someone who actually trained under Luke Skywalker for God knows how many years, and is a vicious killer who has the ability to actually use the Force to stop freaking laser bolts in the middle of the air. But so they created this concept that the Force was just basically this catch-all plot.
Insulation.
Well, I'd say it was a plot contrivance, basically.
Yeah.
It's this catch-all plot contrivance where no matter how bad things get for the heroes, I mean, look at the end of The Last Jedi where Rey just shows up and all of a sudden she knows how to move rocks with the Force, not just one
A lot
rock,
of, like a mountain's
like,
worth.
yeah, like an entire avalanche full of rocks. And never was she set up to have that type of power.
This kind of happened.
Well, most Jedi in training, they have a hard time even moving like a single small rock. I mean, we have this great scene in Empire Strikes Back where Yoda proves that size doesn't matter, that it doesn't matter how big or how small the thing is because we're all connected through the Force. You can move that as if it were weightless. And that was like a big lesson for Luke, where it kind of shattered his preconceived notions of what was possible. And Rey never had one of those epiphanies. She never earned her powers. They were always just kind of given to her. Whereas Luke and to some extent Anakin had to basically, learn to harness their natural abilities and kind of like unlearn what they had learned previously. And they actually earned their powers. And I think that was one of the big things that most of the critics of The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens harp on the most, is that Rey has never had to earn anything. It's given to her because the plot demands that she know it at that point. Because I could just see J.J. Abrams, sitting there thinking like, we need to have this really awesome lightsaber battle at the end of The Force Awakens, but I couldn't spend a whole movie before this setting up Rey learning how to use a lightsaber, so I'm just going to let her know how to immediately be a master with a lightsaber by foreshadowing that she has some melee skill with a staff, but also the Force just like grants her the power that she needs to kind of know how to use the lightsaber.
Yeah, she just gets everything from the Force, and that brings me to another part of your article that I think a lot of people listening would actually like to benefit from or would be interested in. Is that first of all this stuff that the story just gives her, it kind of blocks her from having a character arc. And the character arc you identify as one of the 5 major stages of writing a strong character. So the first major stage is that you name is the character arc. The arc meaning where a character starts off one place and then through the course of the story ends up somewhere else. Changed for the better, maybe for the worse. But they learn skills along the way. They mature. They develop. And that's something that being a Mary Sue robs from the character. Because since the Mary Sue is given everything, given all the skills, given all the weapons, everything they need to go through the plot, they don't have any chance to develop in any way. They don't have any room to grow. They're just kind of static.
Yeah, the 5 things I kind of list out in the article, they're kind of geared towards creating a strong character versus a weak character from a narrative perspective. So when I'm talking about a strong character, I don't mean a character that's physically strong. It can
Right.
like lift like a two by like a
You know,
truck over its head or whatever.
a
But
well-written character.
I'm talking about a character that audiences can identify with and learn to love and root for and things of that nature. The first of those five things is to give a character arc. Now, this isn't always a hard and fast rule because it is possible to have characters who are static, who don't change in your narrative, and have them be just as interesting and as strongly written as a character who does have a character arc.
Mhm.
But there is a big difference here, and I'll explain that difference in a bit. So the best way to kind of have a character arc is to show some type of transformation happen, and this is kind of inherent in the hero's journey, which is the story path, that the master plot that Luke Skywalker kind of walks down, right? And the hero's journey is just a natural character arc progression, and what that does is it takes someone who is weak at the beginning and transforms them into someone who is strong by the end, someone who's a hero. And there are various ways you can do that, but the fact is that as an audience member, when you see a character change, you become more attached to that character because you feel like you're growing along with them. It's kind of like the same concept of watching your children grow up. Like as they change, like you become more attached and more invested in your child,
Right.
because you see them maturing and you become proud of them and you want them to succeed and stuff like that. It's kind of the same psychological concept behind a character arc and the transformation of a character. Now, in terms of a Mary Sue, typically a Mary Sue does not have an actual character arc. They're they are what is called a static character, which is basically they never change, they never transform. At the beginning of the at the end of the movie, they're the same character they were at the beginning of the movie. Now, sometimes this can work, like for instance, Captain America, right?
I would say
Uh,
the static character tends to work in the era of Pulp Fiction. That those sort of story types where you just have a this rough, tough character who you just want him to go see him fight the bad guy, solve the crime. Conan the Barbarian, he's really interesting, but he doesn't really change per story. He just kind of gets involved in things and then beats up whatever is coming his way.
Yeah. So for a static character, the challenge as a writer, as a storyteller, becomes how do we make this character interesting? Because they're not going to change. How do we get audiences to invest in them? And there are a couple of different ways you can do this. Like, for instance, having the character actively resist changing is a good way to kind of get the audience invested. Because when you, like, for instance, Superman, Superman's biggest thing is his moral code, right? So when you have bad guys who are trying to get him to violate that moral code by killing someone or what have you, you see the strength of the character, not the physical strength, the internal fortitude, where he's resisting temptation to crossing that line that he drew for himself that he never wanted to cross. And so you're actually rooting for the character to stay static as opposed to changing, because you know that the change would destroy the character that you've come to know and love. So there's ways to do that. However, the Mary Sue doesn't do that at all, because by the very definition, the Mary Sue never actually encounters any type of obstacle or struggle that she can't overcome with the snap of her fingers. So there's actually no dilemma there. There's no struggle. There's no conflict. She just, any kind of obstacle that's put in her path, she just overcomes it instantly and effortlessly. And that becomes boring. That becomes a situation where the audience fails to invest in the character or starts to resent the character because they feel like she's not earning her wins and things of that nature. And I think Ray kind of definitely falls into that category.
Exactly, and the struggle is another one of the five stages of a strong character. A character needs to have some sort of obstacle that puts their strengths and skills to the test. Even if they're a static character, it's not an interesting story unless they have to struggle in some way. That even the tip top warrior of Conan the Barbarian, the man who's stronger than everyone and can outfight pretty much anything. He has to encounter things that put his great strength to the test. he might not change by the end of the story, but he has to be tested. He has to struggle because the audience wants to see him earn his victories. And that is a good identification right there. So the second one we're mentioning here, I think there's a fourth one you actually mentioned in the list, but the second one we're mentioning here is the second stage of a good character is struggle. The first one being a character arc, if you want to see them change. The second one would be struggle because they have to have a struggle in order to change. I'm not sure. The first thing that comes to my mind is that DS9 episode, Star Trek DS9 episode where Odo gets a baby changeling, and he wants to go easy on it, so he never gives it any struggles. So his doctor, the man who raised him, says, if it never has any pain, if it never encounters anything that tests it, it'll just be content to lie there and waste its life away, waste its existence, never understand or develop its potential. So that's what the struggle does. It moves your character, let's say, farm boy Luke Skywalker. It moves that character from one place to another because it puts his skills, his mind, his beliefs, whatever, it puts something important to the character to the test. And that's what the audience wants to see.
Yeah, like audiences respect characters who are able to overcome adversity. And every time a character in a story is able to overcome adversity in some way, shape, or form, the audience, uh, the audience's connection to that character strengthens. And so, in order to have a strong character, you need to have a character who is able to meet these obstacles head on and figure out some way to emerge victorious in facing them. And that's something that, if you look at every good movie out there, the characters do that. Every good TV show, the characters do that, and they don't have to be like some like world-ending, type of adversity. They don't even need to be a physical adversity. It could be a social adversity or a mental adversity or spiritual adversity. But audiences like to see characters who are smart and resourceful and able to basically overcome the odds to achieve victory. And what makes truly classic characters that audiences just love are that the characters earn their victories. They're not just handed to them. They, even though like you may know, oh, this is the main character, ultimately they're going to win. But when you see how hard they struggle to earn that win, that's what makes us fall in love with them. Whereas opposed if the win was just kind of handed to them, then you're kind of like, I don't really care. So like a good example of this, and I mentioned it in my article, is the character of Indiana Jones.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And Indiana Jones is a character who works really, really hard for his wins. And when he loses, like he loses not through any fault of his own because he did everything within his power to try and win. And so when he falls short, the audience has a strong sympathy towards him that strengthens their connection to that character. And when he does finally win, the audience cheers because they're like, finally, like he earned that victory, So I love the example of Indiana Jones because it's just such a quintessential thing where, he's smart enough to get past all the traps in the tomb, and then he gets the idol, and you think like, he nailed it, like everything's cool, and then like the traps get sprung, and then
Giant
like
rock falls.
Yeah, he has to avoid the traps, and then he gets betrayed by his guide, and then he has to just barely like get out of there, and he like recovers the idol, but then as soon as he escapes, he's ambushed, and then like he escapes the ambush, but he loses the idol, and they try to kill him. He makes it to his plane, and even as he's being whisked away to safety, there's a snake in his lap, and he starts freaking out. And so it's just like everything goes wrong for this guy, but like, despite all that stuff, he perseveres. And that's something that's just like so quintessential of a strong, well-written character. And so if you look at a character like Rey or any Mary Sue, this never happens. I think probably a good example we can point to is the scene where she meets Finn in The Force Awakens, and the TIE fighters show up, and they have to run to the spaceship to, find a way to get away. But the thing is that there's no real obstacle there. So, for instance, when the TIE fighters come swooping in and start shooting at them, they're running away. You know that they're not going to get hit. You know, they're not going to die.
Yeah.
So they run to the Millennium Falcon. She miraculously knows how to pilot this thing, and the Tie fighters chase them, and they shoot down the Tie fighters, and they fly into space, and they're safe. Now, you could argue that the obstacles or the adversity is in the Tie fighters that are chasing them because they're trying to kill them. But if you contrast this with Indiana Jones, there's nothing at stake here other than them trying to get away, right?
Right.
Um, so, like, if, for instance, there was an added plot element to that scene where, they not only had to get away from the TIE fighters, but they had to achieve some other type of goal that was very important. Otherwise, people would die or something like that. Then I could understand it being like a stronger scene. But as it stands, it's not so much Rey overcoming adversity; it's the plot showcasing Rey's skill as a pilot, and that just I can remember watching it in the theater. I was like, "This is a great scene. This is fun," but it ultimately rings hollow. It's not something that the character really earned. Like if she had been kind of like incompetent at flying the ship, and she was getting into like trouble, and like the TIE fighters were closing in on her, and she was kind of learning how to do it as she went under the most stressful of circumstances, then I think it would be a good argument to say like, okay, this was not a Mary Sue type scene. But she's like, she's one of these, she cuts the power in the middle of the air and the ship falls and lines it up right for a perfect shot, and then she like hits the power right at the last minute and zooms away. I mean, that's stuff that you'd expect a highly trained pilot to be able to pull off, not someone who I guess maybe practiced in simulators on her desert planet somewhere.
Some great expert of some sort.
Exactly.
In that case, the scene goes from having her struggle to escape or struggle to do some sort of goal, kill someone, accomplish something. It goes from struggle to just being a scene that just shows off how awesome she already is, which again
Yeah,
helps
like
negate her arc.
she never actually struggled in that scene. Like, if so we know BB-8 has this MacGuffin that the bad guys are after, but she doesn't know that BB-8 really has this thing, and she's not really invested in the overall struggle, and so like she's not she's not a protector of this information. She's not a protector of Finn. She just things start shooting at her and she reacts, and that's another part of the difference between a strongly written character and a poorly written character, which is strongly written characters are proactive. They make choices and take actions that drive the plot and the story forward. Whereas a reactive character, the plot or the story does something, and the character is thrust into a situation where they have to react to that. And thus the plot just kind of moves them along like pieces on a chessboard. And that example in The Force Awakens is a prime example of this concept of reactivity, in the sense that, what else is a character going to do when the bad guys start shooting at them? They're going to run. And they just so happen to run to the Millennium Falcon, which just so happened to be there. Hello, plot contrivance.
Yep.
And then, like, she flies away, and she does what any character in that situation would do, which is she tries to, evade the TIE fighters and shoot them down or what have you.
That is another stage of the of strong character. Is are they active? Are they the ones driving things along? Because usually what you see in Mary Sue's, typically we read fan fiction or whatever. If you a Mary Sue is a character that just wants to play in that world. They don't want to really do the story. They want to go through the struggles or anything. They just kind of want to go in there and be kind of a fangirl or fanboy. Just play around in that environment. So what happens is that they're playing around, and then things just happen to them because things need to happen. So a common trope of a Mary Sue is that things tend to happen to them. They don't really do anything because that's seen as aggression, seen as they don't want to be the bad guy. Everyone else is the bad guy. It's a harsh world, and the Mary Sue is the only one that can deal with it, handle it, or change things. And yeah,
Yeah,
that
I mean,
like that, yeah.
it comes down to the plot dictating what the character does, as opposed to the character dictating how the plot unfolds. And it all comes down to the character's choices, and whether or not the character is reacting to something or being proactive in something. So, like for instance, in A New Hope, Luke, he proactively decides to go after R2 when he runs away. He could have just said, it's a droid, it'll find its way back, or we'll get a new one. But instead of allowing that to happen, he goes after it. He gets attacked by the Sand People. He's rescued by Ben Kenobi. Ben Kenobi kind of offers to, take him on a new step of the journey, and he refuses. Goes back home, finds out that the stormtroopers killed his parents, and then at that point, he makes the decision to leave Tatooine and follow in the footsteps of his father to become a Jedi. And that's a very powerful, proactive set of events in which this main character, is making decisions that moves the plot forward. Because if he decides to just stay on Tatooine, they never go to Mos Eisley, they never meet Han Solo, they never try to go to Alderaan and run into the Death Star and all this other stuff that happens because of that decision. So I'm not going to say that every decision a Mary Sue makes is reactive, because they can make proactive decisions. Like for
Right.
instance, in The Force Awakens, when Rey sees this scatter kind of trapping BB-8, she makes the proactive decision to go save that robot, even though it doesn't make any sense that she does it, but she makes the decision to do it. But you have to kind of weigh the number of reactive decisions against the number of proactive decisions when trying to determine whether a character is strong or weak. And if you look at Rey's decisions in over the course of both movies, The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, she has way more reactive choices than she does proactive choices.
Oh yeah, by a lot.
Yeah, and that's a sure sign that the character is poorly written, is that the plot dictates what she does.
I think the main reason for that is Luke actually has what There's something behind Luke that keeps him making decisions, that keeps him actively going to one place after another, going to one event after another, that keeps him overcoming these struggles, even when the things seem impossible, that keeps him growing, and that Luke actually has an identifiable motivation to keep pushing. He wants to become like a hero, like he thinks his father is. And
Yeah, and Luke, he has a goal, and the goal is very clearly stated in Episode 4, New Hope, where he says, "I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like
like
my
my
father."
father,
And
right?
then if you look at Return of the Jedi, the end of the saga, that moment where he throws his lightsaber away and faces the Emperor, and he says, "I'm a Jedi like my father before me." That's the culmination, the achievement of his character arc that started in A New Hope. And it's so perfectly written. Like if you look at all three movies as a whole and you see his journey from this naive farm boy to that moment where he declares himself a Jedi, just like his father, which was the exact same goal that he set out for himself at the beginning of his journey. And then you take that and you contrast it with Rey, and what was her stated purpose? What was her stated journey?
Her
The only
only, yeah,
thing
the only
she
one
ever
was,
said, yeah, was she wanted to wait for her parents to come
yeah,
back to Jakku.
she wanted to wait for her parents. It's not just something that drives her along. At least Luke's motivation is he wants to become a hero, which keeps him moving. Rey's motivation is sort of passive, even if that remain her motivation throughout the entire series.
Well, beyond Luke's motivation to be a hero, like he had those dreams of kind of getting off of his farm and becoming a war hero like his dad or like whatever. But in addition to that, Luke has a very strong sense of loyalty to his family. Even his father, who's like the most evil man in the galaxy, or
Right.
second most evil man, he feels some obligation to try to save him because he cares for his family. He places his family uh, first and foremost, and in addition to that, his friends as well, people like Han Solo and Chewbacca and stuff. And if you look at Rey, I think they tried to do something very similar to that, in the sense that They wanted her to be searching for a family,
Hmm.
kind of like what Luke was looking for, but she never really places that much importance on family that Luke did. Yeah, she goes and she saves him, but like she saves these people because the plot demands that she does it. She never really has any real strong connection to these people. Even like her connection with Han Solo was like very brief and kind of surface level, you know. So and she hardly met any of these people in the Resistance before she went off to go find Luke. The only person that she actually had any real development with was Finn, and within the Last Jedi, I think they had maybe like one scene together, you know. So like, there's no feeling that she actually has um, this emphasis on family that Luke did, because we can all relate to the idea of wanting to go off and save our sister or our best friend or help our father, you know. But when it comes to Rey, she doesn't have any of these relatable goals that we can see, at least. Like her goal is like, oh, I want to wait for my parents. And then when Han Solo offers her the chance to kind of live her own life, she rejects it. She runs away, and then she gets captured, and she's just kind of like brought along on this series of events that kind of she reacts to, culminating in her showdown with Kylo Ren at the end of that movie, and then she goes off to find Luke, and then we all know how that goes.
Yeah.
So it's her goals are very murky. Like, we don't know what it is she wants. We don't know what she's trying to achieve. She doesn't really have any strong allegiances to anything. She's kind of like with the Resistance just because, like, she
Like
never
she's
really.
supposed to do that. It's kind of like the plot
Yeah,
says she's supposed to
yeah,
be with Resistance, so she is.
yeah. And she's not really a Jedi. She's not really anything, and it's hard for audiences to really latch onto a character that doesn't have any clear motivation or clear arc.
And the other one is likability. Now you say that Rey is likable. She probably is. She has a lot of good traits. She's really good at what she does. All that. And she's funny sometimes, I guess, both ironically and unironically. But to me she's not likable. I didn't really like her, and that's mainly because she doesn't have the other four of these sections and these stages, and that mainly it's the struggle. And she's not struggling, which makes me not like her, because she's just handed things, and nobody likes the person who's just handed things in life and then people clap that they got rewarded with something they never earned. To me, that's one of the criteria for a likable character, is whether they earn things or not. Uh, but those are the five stages. The arc is the arc there. Is there an arc available? Now, if it's a static character, then obviously you don't need an arc. But in this situation, in Rey's particular situation, she does require an arc, especially if they're trying to emulate the original trilogy, the original Star Wars trilogy. And
Yeah,
then,
like if they had started off Rey as someone who was like a natural force user who knew how to use these powers but was kind of unrefined,
right,
and she was kind of like hiding away in this planet because she was scared of what these powers meant for her or whatever. Like, you could have had that, because when we talk about character arc, we're not just talking about the transformation, we're talking also about the struggle to stay static, if that is indeed the type of character that you're telling. So there needed to be some type of struggle for her to remain the way she was. And if you just start off, instead of trying to do the hero's journey with her, if you just start off like she's already gone through training or what have you, then okay, great, she can pull off all this
yeah,
stuff, and there's no narrative logic flaw
yeah, that's a good
in
point.
believing that she can do this.
In fact, I had to have a hypothesis, or I have a small tweak I would change, and I think I mentioned this before, some other stream or whatever. But I would change, if I could change anything about the Force Awakens, is that instead of waiting for her family, I would say that Rey is a Padawan waiting for her master to return when Finn finds her and everything, and then her motivation would then be to, she would be convinced to say that her master isn't coming back. Like, he hasn't come back for all this, maybe years or months, however long it's been. And then Finn somehow convinces her to take that journey and go find her master. and that way she's been developed in the Force. She knows
Or,
other
she
skills.
could have been a student of Luke's at the school, and when Kylo Ren's uprising happened, she escaped and she's been out. Like there's all types of things that you could have done to kind of establish her skill with the Force and stuff like that.
Right.
That for whatever reason J.J. Abrams chose not to do.
I get why they wanted
Um,
to start her off as a similar character to Luke, where she's just a nobody. She has no real training in anything. They wanted to emulate the original trilogy, where it's just a regular person becomes a hero. But in order for Rey to fit as a character in the narrative they set up, it would make more sense if she already started off with a bunch of skills, which they could still do even with an arc, but they
or
didn't.
if she had met a mentor character instead of Han Solo,
Oh yeah,
someone who could actually kind of give her a little bit of tutelage in how to use the Force, so that when she uses it later on in the movie, it's been properly set up and the audience accepts it. I mean, they did that in A New Hope, where Luke didn't have like a huge amount of training, but Obi-Wan gave him enough so that by the end of the movie, we're like, okay, yeah, like I accept that. Luke
yeah.
could use the Force
It was
to
it was
help.
believable enough.
Exactly. And getting back to one of the reasons why I think people do defend the character of Rey
Mm.
is because of her likability factor. Um, because even if a character is like really weakly written, if the character is likable, uh, then audiences are willing to forgive a lot of errors with that character in regards to that character. So the a old kind of mentor of mine named Michael Hogg. I'd taken a seminar of his when I was in college, and it was a great seminar. It was on screenwriting, and he kind of went through the aspects of what can instantly make a character likable, and there are four of them basically. And I never forgot these because they were just so like clearly defined and accurate that any writer can use these as a trick, and the more of them that you use, the more likable your character is going to be.
Right.
And so like audiences like characters who are extremely competent, like good at what they do. Audiences like characters that can make them laugh, that are funny. Audiences instantly sympathize with characters who are a recipient of undeserved misfortune, and they're also uh, drawn to characters who have a strong moral code that they do not break or bend for any reason. So, like, if you look at a character like Indiana Jones, for instance, at the opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark, we get all four of these things, in the very opening scene, where we see him as being extremely good at what he does. He's very competent. He's able to get past all these traps. Um, he is a recipient of an undeserved misfortune because he's not only betrayed by his companion twice, but just as he escapes, he's ambushed and he has the thing that he just risked his life for stolen.
Right.
The character's funny, like
Mm-hmm.
his reaction to the snake as he's escaping, the look on his face when the boulder comes after him, stuff like that. And, his strong moral code where it belongs in a museum. Like he actually cares about the history of these relics. He's not just someone who's out there for, fortune and glory.
Right. It gives them dimension, and also gives them a the right to hold the title of protagonist. We need to have someone competent. We need to have someone who can entertain us, because it's not just serious all the time. It can be a little bit of fun, a little bit funny, whether he wants to be or not, and have a strong moral code. I mean, he doesn't have to be necessarily a good moral code. I like to point out usually like House, MD, or Underwood, Francis Underwood. They, I like Francis Underwood because he's very compelling, mainly because he has that strong center, that strong morality he has. It's just not moral morality; it's more immoral, more like a self gratification.
Well, even Underwood has his own type of code that he
Right.
sticks by,
Hmm.
and that's always been kind of like, he's more of a Machiavellian character
Right.
in that sense. But like, take those four likability criteria and apply them to a character like, for instance, Captain Marvel. I don't know if you've seen the most recent Captain Marvel movie, but um, they try to apply all four of these to Captain Marvel, but for some reason she comes off as not being likable. And the reason for that is because, she is a Mary Sue.
Mm.
So you're not as invested in her, but also these attempts kind of fall flat because she's not very funny. She tries to be, but she's not. She's so good at what she does that it's unbelievable. Her undeserved misfortune uh, just happens to be the thing that gave her these incredible powers. So it's not really a misfortune if you think about it.
It's a Mary Sue misfortune.
Yeah,
It's something
yeah,
bad that happens to her, but she gains from it anyway.
yeah, and her moral code is very murky. Like there's a scene in the movie where this biker kind of like rides up next to her as she's trying to figure out like where to go, and he kind of like starts hitting on her or whatever, very very badly. And it's kind of like, oh, look at this guy, like he's a male chauvinist or whatever. And so that gives her the justification to basically steal his bike and drive off on it. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, that's kind of a moral code in the sense that he was a douchebag, so he kind of deserved to have his ride stolen. But at the same time, like you stole a guy's ride for, you know, hitting on you, basically.
It's not a very heroic thing to do.
Yeah, and so like that type of moral ambiguity there, it's insulting to a certain segment of your audience. Like as a man watching that, I was like, well, couldn't you have figured out like a better way to justify stealing a bike?
I mean,
Or
it might work if she was an anti-hero, just like
yeah,
kind
but
of
she's not.
grayish. Yeah, she's supposed to be
this very powerful
paragon.
superhero, the super soldier or whatever. And a character who steals someone's bike, I mean, that can work, but the way they tried to justify it was just very insulting to, I think, the men in the audience. And that's not always something that you have to be cognizant of, because you can have kind of male chauvinist characters like that are sleazy, and male audiences don't like them.
Yeah,
And so
usually those characters are the kind of guys who just go in with their wife beaters on, yell at women, want to slap them around, beat them up for no reason.
yeah,
Like, get
and
my beer faster, that sort of thing.
I kind of I like to refer to this scene in the movie Twilight where Bella is kind of cornered in this town by a group of guys who just happen like, hey, let's rape this chick. She's out here alone. Like we're just gonna rape her.
Yeah.
And then Edward kind of swoops in on his car and saves her and drives away. But it's just like, really, like small Seattle town just has rape gangs kind of randomly walking around. And it was such a contrived thing. And I think that scene in Captain Marvel was very contrived. And that's something that I think a lot of writers need to be aware of, is like, how much of a plot contrivance is this? Like, I know what I want to communicate about my character, but the situation that we communicate this in has to be something that's palatable to the audience. Otherwise, they're going to reject it. And the minute you start having audience members reject elements of your story, that's the minute that they're taken out of the movie, their suspension of disbelief is gotten rid of, and they start being very critical of what they're seeing.
Right. That's exactly what happened in that scene with. 'Cause I saw that scene with Captain Marvel where she steals that guy's motorcycle. It's more of an unbalance, because if she's trying to be the hero, she's supposed to be this paragon hero, and she just steals this guy's bike. Now, as you said, there are times when even men would want to beat up these guys, and it usually but it has to fit. It has to balance. It can't be just this guy walks up and hits on her, and he can be a little bit of an asshole, but it's not. But it has to balance out. The crime has to fit the punishment. If he's just being a little bit of a dick, isn't earn from a paragon. It does not earn him getting beat up and his ride stolen. If she was trying to be a paragon and was trying to be like a smart, clever paragon, she could have just as easily said something witty that destroyed his self-esteem, or just outsmart him in some clever little way. But they go all the way overboard, and they justify it because he's a man, and it could be pretty much any man. Just the whole concept of heterosexuality, of men being attracted to women, is something that's punishable in some of these movies nowadays.
Yeah, but the point I was trying to make about
Mm.
Captain Marvel is that the writers of that movie took all four of these likability criteria that Michael Hogue kind of laid out, and they applied them to the character, and yet they failed. Like, she was not a likable character, even though they tried really hard to get her to be
Mhm.
likable. I don't think she ultimately connected with audiences. Now, that's not to say all audience members didn't find her likable. I'm sure there were some who did, but they when you're trying to make a character likable, you want to make them likable to the broadest possible audience. And so if you look at a character like Indiana Jones, setting aside his gender for a second, like, you could have made Indiana Jones a woman,
Right.
but the way that these elements, these four criteria, are introduced within the opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark are just so much well executed than they were in Captain Marvel. And by extension, the character of Rey in the Force Awakens. Now, I feel like the character of Rey was quite likable in The Force Awakens, and this kind of
Mhm.
likability factor diminished in The Last Jedi, just because the writing of that movie was so inherently flawed. But I feel like a lot of the defense for the character of Rey, in terms of like defending her Mary Sue-ness, comes from the fact that people genuinely liked her in The Force Awakens. And so, out of all five criteria that I kind of laid out for strong character versus weak character, this is the one area that Ray actually kind of succeeds in. And it's probably the most important one because, like I said before, if you like a character, you can forgive a lot of other flaws.
Right. I think that's one of the things that differentiates Ray from Captain Marvel. Uh, One thing that Ray has going for her is that, well, I don't really like her. I can see why other people do, because she is competent at everything she does, anything she tries really, and then she does have a moral code. She is funny. But one thing she doesn't have though is this underlying sense of malice and smugness that Captain Marvel has, and that's sort of, for example, I would see if Ray does something better than someone else, for example, like when she fixed the Millennium Falcon better than Han Solo could, she's more happy about it. She's just, I'm glad to be of service. I'm glad that I helped out. I'm glad I saved us, and that's pretty much it. If I would imagine if Captain Marvel was in that same position, she'd fix it. She'd say, silly man, just fix it, and then just give him like a little smirk or malicious little smile, and like, yeah, I'm better than you, that sort of thing. That's what her character's vibe gives off, and I think that's why it kind of negates all the likability factors that they try to instill in her.
Yep, I agree. Ray was extremely kind of like wide-eyed and
Mhm.
innocent in the Force Awakens. Like, she was independent. Like they made a big deal about this thing. It's like, don't grab
Right.
my hand when you're running away, or like, she kind of the filmmakers made clear that she didn't need a man to help her in these situations.
Yeah, that was
And
one.
so,
But and on that particular situation, it kind of fit her character. I mean, she kind of doesn't really
yeah,
have
like,
one.
it didn't feel like as agenda driven as something like it did in Captain Marvel, but it was still like quite noticeable
Mhm.
in the movie. But even though it was established that she was quite independent and self sufficient and stuff like that, she also uh, kind of had the sense of wonder about her. Like, right after they escape the Tie Fighters, and she meets up with Finn, and they're both like so jazzed that they just survived that thing. And she was like, "And did you see when I did this and when I did this and when I did?" And like, in a way, at that point, she's become an audience surrogate where she's just excited about what had just happened. And so like, you're right in the sense that she portrays these Mary Sue qualities of hers in a way that's very palatable to the audience, where it's kind of like innocent in a way. Whereas with Captain Marvel, I think you hit the nail on the head with her smugness, where it was just like she was a very kind of like cocky, self-centered character, and her attempts at humor came off as kind of condescending and mean-spirited, in my opinion. So there's definitely that.
Right. That's the whole thing about Captain Marvel. I mean, that's why. everyone seemed to hate her right off the bat is because she emulates this whole attitude that everyone hates about all these whatever SJW characters and NPC characters, whatever you want to call them. Is that all these kind of characters that people hate so much? It's all about smugness and them being morally superior to you for whatever reason. I think the same thing applies to way back over there in Ghostbusters 2016 when the creators and the actors reacted to the fans' backlash with smugness and superiority and maliciousness, and then they put that in the movie, and they made like the main bad guy one of the like a nerd proxy, like a audience member proxy, and then they just make fun of him, and everything this after that just comes off as smug and just makes him unlikable.
Yeah, having worked in Hollywood, there is first of all, you have to understand that I'd say probably 60 to 75% of everyone who works in Hollywood is very, very insecure. And especially actors and creative people, because like they really put themselves out there. They have to manipulate their emotions, play with their imaginations, all this type of stuff that psychologically and emotionally can kind of mess with you.
Oh yeah.
So any type of criticism, especially on the level of someone who's getting like worldwide releases and stuff like that, it can be very hard to weather. In Hollywood, there's talk about this thing called rhino skin or elephant skin or something like that, where basically you have to build up a certain amount of toughness to criticism. And having been in acting workshops and stuff like that, I can tell you that actors probably get it the worst in the sense that they just get torn to shreds by people who are, critiquing their performances or their looks or something that they have no control over.
I'd imagine so.
And, yeah. And when it comes to the cross section of, that insecurity plus political beliefs or agenda driven beliefs, these Hollywood people can be so sensitive to criticism that when their belief system, forget their talent, their skill, and their looks or whatever, but their own belief system is criticized, then they can get extremely defensive. And I've been in writers' rooms where, like, you're trying to rationally argue your case for the change in the writing of a script, and it's obvious to everyone in the room that objectively you're correct, but the person who wrote the script is sitting there arguing with you tooth and nail because they feel like it's a personal attack on them, as opposed to a critique of their work. And I've been in situations where in these writers' rooms, like fistfights almost broke out. People would leave the room crying.
I believe it. I believe it.
And as an artist, it's very hard to take criticism. And I think that in a situation like Ghostbusters 2016, you had, first of all, it was being shepherded by a studio executive, I believe Sherry Lansing is her name. She was the head of Sony at the time. She was a staunchly feminist executive. And she hired Paul Feig knowing that he had kind of the same like feminist leanings as she did. And there's nothing wrong with being a feminist. There's nothing wrong with wanting to extol the virtues of women, just so long as you don't do it at the expense of men,
Right.
Women have their own type of power and virtue and importance in life and society and stuff like that. And there's no reason that we can't extol those things, like, put them at the forefront and celebrate them. But when you do it by denigrating the same thing with men, then you start to get some resentment there. But I think that the problem with Ghostbusters was that they disrespected the movies that came before it by like recasting the entire cast as female. Now, I think that inherently that's not a bad thing if you do it right. But the fact that they were kind of like saying, oh, these other movies never happened, here are four women that you don't really know anything about, and they're going to be your heroes now. That kind of set the original fans on edge to begin with. And then when it came out, because one of the great things about Ghostbusters and why it's such a well-written movie, at least the first one, is that it's not necessarily a comedy. Like, there are comedic elements to it, but if you really look at the master plot of that film, it's a underdog story. It's the story of rags to riches almost, but with a little bit more of a high concept bent to it, because it's these guys who are really good at their jobs. The recipients of an undeserved misfortune getting fired at the beginning, and they go into business for themselves, and it's a struggling business, and you see them not only succeed in business but have to fight this ever growing obstacle of evil, and they're just ordinary guys. So you have this very kind of concrete underdog master plot there, where the original Ghostbusters wasn't a comedy, and then you have Paul Feig come in with Ghostbusters 2016, and it's like, no, it's an out and out absurdist comedy. It's not even grounded in reality like the comedy in the first Ghostbusters was, where the comedy came from the interpersonal reactions or interactions between the characters. This stuff was it was Saturday Night Live jokey.
Yeah, it was mainly improv. They said a lot of it was anyway.
Oh, definitely. But the problem there is that most Ghostbusters fans, to most Ghostbusters fans, that type of comedy is not Ghostbusters. That's something completely different. And when the first trailer came out for that movie, and it became obvious what type of movie we were going to get, the original fans were upset because it was not what they had come to expect. Like, first of all, they're like, oh, we're not getting a Ghostbusters 3, we're getting a reboot. Okay, fine. Oh, the reboot is, all four of these female characters that we don't know about, and they're goofy as hell. Like, they're not playing characters. It's Kristen Wiig, it's Melissa McCarthy, it's all these actors that we know from Saturday Night Live. They're just playing themselves, and the humor doesn't work for this fan base. And so when the criticism of that started coming in, like, there was like legitimate criticism, the filmmakers instantly saw that as, oh, it's rooted in not in legitimate criticism, it's rooted in sexism, because these women are extremely talented and they deserve to be praised for their comedic talents. And we made what we believe to be a good progressive movie with a good message for little girls. And if you don't like that, that means you're against women and little girls. And it's like, no, you can be in favor. You can be a feminist, and you can be in favor of promoting feminism, or giving little girls idols to look up to. But you can also be a savvy storyteller, a savvy critic, someone who understands what they like and what they don't. And I think too often in Hollywood, and especially on the internet, like Twitter and stuff like that, you have these issues where people conflate legitimate criticism with some type of negative connotation in a political sense, where it's like, oh, if you didn't like Ghostbusters 2016, you're a misogynist, you hate women. It's like, no, I hate bad stories and badly written stories and unfunny comedies.
It's not our movie that's wrong. It's you guys that are wrong.
But, like, I like to say that if Ghostbusters 2016 had not had the Ghostbusters title to it, if it had been something completely, separate from, the Ghostbusters everyone knows and loves, it probably would have been much better received. But because it completely disrespected the source material that it was based on, the fans of that source material felt disrespected. And that's the same thing that you're seeing happen with Star Wars, is that the sequel trilogy has routinely, especially with The Last Jedi, disrespected everything that came before it. And that's what's upsetting fans, not some misogynist, racist, sexist agenda, whatever. It's the fact that the people making these new movies seem to have zero respect for anything that came before, which is the stuff that the people fell in love with in the first place. And as a storyteller, especially someone who is kind of picking up the torch from the original and taking it further,
Right.
you have to be aware of your audience. I think a lot of people in Hollywood believe that they're the ones who kind of are the tastemakers. They're the ones who dictate what you should and shouldn't like, as opposed to trying to figure out what it is the audiences want and then giving it to them. And that's the big distinction here, I think, especially when it comes to Star Wars, is that Lucasfilm, under Kathleen Kennedy's leadership, has been trying to tell us what type of Star Wars we want, as opposed to listening to us and giving us the type of Star Wars we want.
And I think that reminds me of a quote by Alan Moore. I'm not really sure the exact quote right now, but he said something along the lines as do not forget those who have come before you. And the thing is that storytelling and writing has always been a tradition. Ever since, from the cavemen, it's always been the oral tradition, carry on one story to the next generation by telling these stories over and over again. And it's imperative that if you go into a work, that you remember who came before you, what happened before you, even if it's your own original IP. If you move into the genre, if you do genre fiction, maybe do hard-boiled crime, you can do what you want, but you always have to remember that people have already defined this before you. That if you say what you're going to do, you can't just forget all the tropes and promises that come with writing such fiction or genre fiction bring to the audience. You have to adhere to what has been laid out. You have to travel that road and then maybe make your own path. But you have to start off on that road. It's already been paved. And basically the idea is that you can't forget what's already come before. You're picking up a very noble tradition, storytelling, and you're continuing it. But you have to remember that there's been other people before you that have been constructing these roads and constructing these other stories, and you have to be respectful. You can do what you want. Just be respectful. And that goes twice as much as when you're doing something like as big as Star Wars or we have Ghostbusters, like we mentioned.
Yeah, I think a better quote to point to is one by P.T. Barnum, which is give the audience what they want. And there's this kind of notion out there, I think it's been propagated a lot by J.J. Abrams' company, Bad Robot, in the sense that you have to surprise the audience. Like the audience shouldn't expect certain things from you. And that kind of goes towards this whole like expectation subverted trope.
Right.
That kind of has been destroying stuff lately.
Yeah, because they're trying to subvert the wrong expectations, or at least not do it well enough.
Well, I mean, here's the point I'm trying to make here is that good writers are writers who take into account their audience. And just because you're giving the audience what they want doesn't mean that you have to be predictable in how you do it.
Right.
And a great example of this, and this is kind of recent with because we're doing this interview around the time that Game of Thrones' final season aired, is Game of Thrones. And you have a situation where the show is based on a series of books by a very talented author named George R.R. Martin. And the first 4 seasons of the show were kind of based on these books. They pulled directly from the source material. And then after the 4th season, from season 5 to season 8, it was the show's writers who were kind of doing fan fiction, essentially, and making up their own story. And the differences between the stuff that was based on the source material and the stuff that was based off of the writer's own original ideas is really startling. And it's very interesting if you listen to the interviews or the commentaries between the original author, George R.R. Martin, and the 2 showrunners, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, and how they approach things. Because Martin says, okay, I've set up stuff. I've laid clues in there. And some people have figured it out. But that doesn't mean that because they figured it out, I'm going to change my story in order to surprise them. Because, this is the story I want to tell. This is what's appropriate to the narrative I've established. And the people who don't see it coming are going to still be surprised, and the people who did see it coming are going to take pleasure in knowing that they figured it out, that they were right. Whereas with Benioff and Weiss, you have many, many instances in the Game of Thrones show where they specifically changed the outcome of something just to surprise the audience, as opposed to having it be um, congruent with the story. Like, for instance, the most famous thing is probably Arya killing the Night King in the final season,
Oh yeah, yeah.
because this is a character she had absolutely no connection to the Night King at all. The Night King had always been kind of established to be Jon Snow's antagonist in his story, and audiences wanted to see a payoff to all that, 7 seasons worth of setup between Jon facing off with the Night King. And in the interviews with Benioff and Weiss, they were like, well, everyone kind of expects Jon to have this face off with the Night King. So we wanted to do something different and surprise everyone and have Arya be the one who killed him. And they had this plan to do this for like 3 seasons. And yet they never set up anything between Arya and the Night King. And they continued to push this whole thing of Night King versus Jon Snow. And so after that episode where Arya kills the Night King, even the most casual audience members, the ones who turn off their critical thinking, came away from that being like, wait a minute, that wasn't right. Now, if you wanted to have Arya kill the Night King, you could have still done that in a satisfactory way, just by having Jon have his moment of showdown with the Night King, because that's something that audiences wanted to have. And by denying audiences what they want, you sour them on the story. Like, my girlfriend was the biggest Game of Thrones fans ever. Like she just loved this show. And in the final season, she's just like, I don't care anymore. They totally destroyed the characters. I don't care. And I'm like, wow. When you lose the hardcore fan, like, my girlfriend, and the casual fan, like
It's
most
not a
people,
good sign.
you know that you've messed up in your writing. And that's just like a perfect example of this notion that you don't always have to subvert expectations. Now, that doesn't mean that as a storyteller, you can't do stuff that audiences don't like within your narrative. But when you do stuff that they don't like, you have to make sure that it was properly set up before you do it. So, for instance, going back to Game of Thrones, the Red Wedding, one of the most iconic scenes in either the book or the TV shows ever made, because it's just such a tragic and surprising scene. But if you look at it, it was set up so that after audiences saw that and saw like these favorite characters of theirs die, they can look back and be like, the signs were there. Okay, I could have seen this coming. It felt appropriate, even though I didn't like it.
Right.
So audiences might not be happy, but at the same time they accept it because there's this notion of setup and payoff, and it was properly set up. So if you have something that your audiences aren't going to respond to well, if you at least set it up properly, they'll accept it even though they won't like it. But when you try to subvert expectations by going against plot logic for the sake of surprise, you're rolling the dice on whether or not you're going to piss off your audience. And once you piss them off, it's very hard to get them back on your side. So you have to be aware of that. I think that a lot of the problem with the new Star Wars movies is that they try to surprise you without earning those surprises and without them having to make sense and things of that nature. So as a writer, I think that the art of the proper setup and payoff is usually lost on people, because it's a fundamental skill to be able to set something off and then pay it off appropriately. But bad writers, poor writers, writers who aren't very skilled, they don't know how to do the proper setup and payoff for stuff. So when you have the setup but no payoff, audiences are left wanting. And then when you have the payoff without any setup, audiences are kind of dissatisfied, because they're like, where did this come from? Like, for instance, going back to the Game of Thrones thing, when Daenerys Targaryen becomes evil That happens within the span of a single episode, you know, and it's like, whoa, like we just spent like 7.5 seasons of her being this kind of righteous protagonist, someone who had a strong moral code, who was considered to be a good guy. And then within the span of maybe like an episode and a half or one episode, she becomes the show's main villain. And there was like, and you have some people and the show's creators say, oh well, we set this up, we've seen her be violent before.
Mhm.
But the issue here is that the setup was not done properly, because all the examples that they point to goes back to the character having a strong moral code. Like Daenerys always had a very strong sense of justice and what was right and wrong. And she particularly identified with characters who used to be like her, in the sense that they were powerless, they were enslaved, they were exploited, they were taken advantage of, particularly women and children. There are multiple examples of her, keeping her husband's men in season one from raping women.
Right.
There are examples of her punishing the slave masters for crucifying children and stuff like that. So every like brutal thing that she'd ever done was justified by her own moral code. And that's one of the reasons why audiences liked her, is because like she had this strong moral code and she never wavered from it. And then within the span of one episode in the final season, the second to last episode, she completely disregards that moral code for no good reason. And if they had set up that she's kind of slowly descending and slowly bending her code and what have you, then that payoff probably would have worked, but it didn't. And that was the moment I feel like the entire audience for the show turned on the show. They could kind of forgive the long night episode where Arya kills the Night King, but the moment where Daenerys became evil rang so hollow and untrue to this audience that had stuck with the show for like 8 years, 9 years, that they just immediately rejected everything. And that was really the episode that I think most people checked out on. They were like, I don't care anymore, because the writing of this season has been so bad.
The writing did kind of degrade fairly quickly after so many seasons of Game of Thrones. Kind of just went downhill fairly quickly, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there were some good parts, but I think I heard that they were just tired of writing Game of Thrones. They just want to end it, and that's not a very good
Yeah,
position to be in.
they were in a position where they were probably being courted to work on Star Wars, and they wouldn't be able to do both Star Wars and Game of Thrones. So they wanted to wrap up Game of Thrones so they could move on to the Star Wars project,
Right, and
which
if
isn't,
I mean, if
it's
you're a
not
writer,
unusual.
it's not that unusual.
Yeah.
I mean, it's they want one thing or another. But sorry to interrupt, but I just want to point out that this happened. This happened with Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle. Like he didn't want to write Sherlock Holmes anymore, but he was kind of lashed to the character, and he tried to kill off the character in that the last one where he faces off with Moriarty and falls off the Reichenbach Falls. But then he brings him back, and you notice that there's a distinct lowering of quality when he brings back Sherlock Holmes as opposed to the ones before the Reichenbach Fall. That's because he didn't want to write it anymore, and that's the same or a similar situation they have here. They don't want to write Game of Thrones anymore, so they just
Well,
end it.
the situation was compounded by the fact that Benioff and Weiss were never good writers to begin with. And that's my personal opinion. I've been saying this since season one, in the sense
Mm-hmm.
that they made a lot of adaptation decisions that from the book, because I was a huge fan of the book, and I'm not a book purist,
Mm-hmm.
but there are certain things that they changed in the adaptation from book to screen that they really didn't need to change, like iconic lines of dialogue, certain character traits, like certain subplots that could have easily been added, that enriched the story, that were like left out. So like I was never a big fan of how they were adapting the books. And then once they ran out of book and started doing their own thing, their flaws as writers really came to the forefront. And one of the interesting things is that these guys, Benioff and Weiss, they never really had any production experience before Game of Thrones. They kind of did trial by fire type thing in terms of learning how to put on a TV show, because before then they had just been straight up screenwriters, you know. And I think DB Weiss hadn't actually done anything up until Game of Thrones, and David Benioff kind of brought him along with him. But if you look at their original stuff, their MO, their modus operandi for writing, doesn't come from a sense of story, narrative, or character. What they do is they latch on to actors, you know, very talented actors,
Mhm.
and then they try to write the character to suit the actor, as opposed to having the actor suit the character, which was kind of how it was in the first 4 seasons. So you have a lot of situations where they're writing for the characters' emotions, their emotive looks on screen. You know, it's less about John and Danny falling in love and more about the look on her face as she, you know, becomes angry and decides to unleash fury on King's Landing, because that's going to get her an Emmy. You know, that you know, change in her facial expression, and that's how these guys think. And a lot of the times, you know, Benioff and Weiss, their weaknesses as writers comes through in the sense that the dialogue's not very good, the plot points make no sense, and things of that nature. And as a writer, as a good writer, you need to make sure that your plot follows some type of logic so that it doesn't take the audience out of, you know, the experience. You need to make sure that your characters stay consistent and, you know, drive the plot forward, as opposed to, you know, the plot driving the characters' actions. And, you know, you need to make sure that the dialogue is good. And on all three of these criteria, Benioff and Weiss have consistently failed when they didn't have books to draw from, source material to draw from. I think what's going to happen when the Star Wars stuff kind of comes to fruition is you're going to see a lot of these same issues kind of carry over, with bad dialogue, nonsensical plotting, and characters being driven by the plot as opposed to the plot being driven by characters. And when we finally get their trilogy, you're going to have, I think, kind of a Last Jedi situation, in the sense that some people are going to defend it out of brand loyalty and the fact that it's probably going to look really, really good.
Right.
It's probably going to be a beautifully shot film. They're probably going to have wonderful actors in it, et cetera, et cetera. But the people who criticize it are going to criticize it based on the quality of the writing, which I think will probably be maybe on par or just like slightly above Rian Johnson quality. So, I mean, we'll have to wait and see for that. But I don't think the future of Star Wars looks very good with these guys working on it.
It seems like it might be more of the same of what Star Wars is doing right now. Poor dialogue, nonsensical plots, and characters being driven by the plot instead of characters driving the plot along.
Yeah, I think J.J. Abrams' biggest mistake was, and maybe not J.J. Abrams, maybe this falls more on Kathleen Kennedy's shoulders, but there was no cohesive plan for the sequel trilogy. You know, they basically wanted to get this movie out quickly. So J.J. Abrams working on The Force Awakens, he has like maybe, I don't know, a very general outline for how he wants the next 2 movies to go, but he's not going to be involved in them. So, and when I say general outline, I'm saying maybe like a paragraph describing what happens in one movie, you know. And while they're making The Last Jedi, it's not even done yet. Rian Johnson is having to write and go into pre-production with his movie. So he was basically working blind, which explains, I think, a lot of probably the character inconsistency and stuff, because he didn't know what was actually happening with The Force Awakens for the most part. But at the same time, you know, he's making all of his own mistakes. And I feel like initially, if they had just plotted out 3 movies in advance and went to these guys and said, hey, okay, here's the structure you have to follow, like these are the events that have to happen, then you would have had a more cohesive kind of vision of how this sequel trilogy was supposed to go. And I think a lot of fans probably would have liked it. But instead, you have basically these 2 auteurs, J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson, kind of going in their own separate direction with how they want this stuff to go. And it's all different from what came before it. And so, you know, it's confusing to a lot of Star Wars fans why Star Wars is being handled this way. And I guess in a way it's not surprising, because with the original trilogy and the prequels, you had George Lucas, whose kind of singular vision kind of, kept these together into, a greater extent. The producer of Empire and A New Hope, Gary Kurtz, who kind of was the leading guy in the original trilogy, who was kind of like for keeping the vision on point. But basically, you have George Lucas, who kind of shepherded 6 movies in this saga. And then all of a sudden, George Lucas is no longer there. And you've got all these different guys coming in doing their take on Star Wars instead of having a cohesive take on it. And it just causes all types of problems.
It would seem to me like the if you look at the original trilogy, it progresses from one movie to the next. And it has Luke's of course it has Luke's story, his arc, his changing from innocent farm boy with wanderlust in his eyes to the developed, strong, um, razor sharp Jedi we see in the third movie. But when you see these sequel trilogies, it seems like nothing's really developed here. It's just things are happening, but there's no developing story. There's no one thing to the
Yeah,
next.
I think the biggest issue with the sequel trilogy is that they actually regressed in order to tell the story. And in that sense, what I'm saying is basically in The Force Awakens, it's like every movie that came before didn't happen. It might as well just be the rebellion and the empire all over again.
Right.
Like what I would have liked to have seen personally is, the New Republic age, and then the First Order comes in out of nowhere and starts throwing that into chaos, as opposed to, oh, this is the status quo. It's basically the same as what came before it. Instead of evolving the story, they just went backwards, and none of it made any sense really. It's like, if you're part of the New Republic, why are you called the Resistance? Why aren't you just the military? Why aren't you just a part, like a special arm of the military that's designed to like deal with the First Order?
That was one of my critiques when I first saw it. I was like, didn't the Republic win? Why are they called the Resistance? And also, why, if the First Order is just this oncoming threat that's trying to take over everything, how come they have all this stuff? Why do they have all these resources, enough to build a planetary shotgun of the Death Star? Where do they get all this? They're not supposed to be the reigning
like,
party here.
Their design, like their stormtroopers, their ships, all this stuff, like it's basically the Empire with like a little touch of paint to it. So I mean, I feel like the biggest issue there is that J.J. Abrams took ignored everything that came before it and just said, okay, here's the status quo. Like Han Solo is a deadbeat father who's like, back on his smuggling days. Like he, every, his character arc in the original trilogy was completely reset. Like he's the same character that he was in A New Hope, that he is in The Force Awakens. And that's very disrespectful to the character.
And Leia seems to be
And
the same character too. She's back where
yeah,
she is.
yeah, I mean, Leia was always kind of a one note character, I felt.
Yeah.
Her arc was really just like a romance arc with Han Solo, but Solo was the one who actually transformed over the course of the 3 movies. But then, like, you have the character of Luke.
They changed him a lot.
Yeah, in The Last Jedi, he's not even the same character. Now, there is this trope out there called the prodigal hero. And that is, a great example of this, even though he's not a hero, is the character from the Western Unforgiven that Clint Eastwood plays. And, that's a guy, he used to be like this really badass gunslinger, this really terrible outlaw guy who was renowned for his brutality. And he met and fell in love with a woman, and kind of retired to a farm and had children and was living like a nice peaceful life. And then after his wife dies, he gets pulled back into his old ways. And by the end of the movie, after his friend dies, he reluctantly becomes the character that he used to be, in order to met out punishment to the people who did all these terrible things.
Right.
And the character of Luke can fall into the prodigal hero trope, which I think was Ryan Johnson's initial um, uh, intention with the character, in the sense that he's bitter, he's old, he's grizzled, he's not the same idealistic youth from the original trilogy. But the way they did it, they completely erased any kind of aspect of that original character that so many people grew up loving. And the idea that Luke Skywalker, as a Jedi Master, a guy who refused to kill his father, who put his life on the line to save his father, even though his father was the most evil man in the universe, a guy who threw away his lightsaber to face down the Emperor in the hopes that his father would choose to save him. Like, this is a character who, because he got a bad feeling about his nephew, was almost going to kill him. Now, what in Luke's character that had been established up to that point would ever leave any audience member to believe that Luke was capable of even considering killing his own nephew, his sister's and best friend's child, the namesake of his mentor? Like, none of it makes sense. None of it is congruent. And it's kind of up there with Daenerys suddenly becoming the Mad Queen, where the shift in established character was so abrupt and so unearned that it turned off audiences on a massive level. And this is why, as a writer, you have to keep in mind not only what came before, but what the audience is going to think about what it is you're writing. Because once the audience turns on you, it's very hard to win them back.
Exactly. And I think one of the reasons, one of the big reasons why I think everyone was so upset at how they treated Luke, and I mean, it'll be fine if they handle it correctly. I mean, I could see Luke becoming this disillusioned hero after the right things happened to him in his life. But you have to keep in mind the span of time that's occurred between the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy. I mean, the original trilogy ended with Luke being this iconic, idealistic hero. Even in his darkest hour, he was still very generous, very kind, very forgiving. And then he had video games and other little comic books and everything that had Luke being still this idealistic, positive-minded guy who's trying to rebuild the Order. And I think that's what the audience, the Star Wars audience, wanted to see. They want to
Yeah,
see
but
this him.
beyond that, the character of Luke is someone who, even though he was dealt a very personal blow, and he failed in resurrecting the Jedi Order,
Right.
he's the type of character who, okay, maybe he sequesters himself on an island for a while to kind of recover and get his thoughts together, but his goal, which would be congruent with the original trilogy, would have been, how can I get Ben Solo to come back to the light? He wouldn't have abandoned him. He wouldn't have abandoned the universe. His character was always one where he put family first and friends first, and that was the most important thing to him. So even though Ben Solo betrayed him,
You
he
still
would
want to
have
save
been,
him.
yes, he would still want to save him, and he would be trying to figure out a way to do that, which is why he would probably sequester himself like he did. But the way Ryan Johnson wrote him was completely antithetical to everything we know about this character. And it's okay to do that if you have a plan for redeeming that
Right.
character.
It would be a good hook, especially with
Yeah.
a character like Luke, but they have
But
to do it correctly.
to subvert expectations again, when Luke finally has his final confrontation with Kylo says, "Are you here to save me?" And Luke just says, "No." And that's the final assassination of Luke's character right there.
I mean, they could have had
Um,
it done correctly. I mean, they could have had it work. They could have had it work just fine if they had some sort of setup where they had Luke. Maybe Luke has taken so many chances over all these years. Maybe he's done, you know, held his hand out like he did with Darth Vader, wanting to redeem person after person, then kept getting betrayed, suffering betrayal after betrayal after betrayal because his own flaw that he's discovered is that he can't really judge people's personalities anymore, or something like that, something to tear away at his idealism. But they didn't show us any of that. He just kind of changed at the step of a finger.
yeah, and it was a failure in the writing. I mean, I understood what Ryan Johnson was trying to do, He just didn't do it right. And because he didn't do it correctly, it turned a lot of people off. Because there are ways you could say, okay, well, it was 30 years since the original trilogy. Luke's gone through a lot of crap. He's changed as a character. But there are certain things that you can't kind of like fundamentally change from a character. You can have them reject it temporarily,
Right.
but they have to eventually come back to, like, if Rey had actually gotten Luke to realize that, he could save Ben,
Yeah.
or if Rey was the one who wanted to kill Ben, and Luke had to teach her that revenge was not the answer. Like, there's a lot of leeway there that you could have played with in that script. But I feel like Rian Johnson, like he's someone who's, kind of came up through indie film. He's someone who, his movies beforehand have always had kind of a dark tone to them, like a cynical tone.
Right.
And I feel like he was not a good fit for Star Wars, because Star Wars, at its core, is always kind of a morality tale. It's
It's a
it's very simple.
romanticism.
Yeah, it's good versus evil, and it's right versus wrong.
It was inspired by the pulps, black and white morality, sort of pulpish writing.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also a hero's journey.
Right.
And so this notion that everything sucks and failure is the best teacher, and all these kind of themes that were woven into the movie The Last Jedi, this stuff is not Star Wars. Like, that's fine if you want to do like a Battlestar Galactica or something that's like much darker or more adult and serious in tone. But Star Wars has always been like a fairy tale. It's always been very simplistic in its morality. And the fun of it is seeing these adventures with these characters who are transforming from like reluctant, normal people into superheroes, or heroes of some measure.
Right. That's why that first scenario you mentioned, where maybe Rey was supposed to guide Luke back to where he was, back to his true self, where he wants to go save Ben instead of trying to kill him. I actually thought that's what was going to happen. And when I first watched The Last Jedi, I thought that somehow Luke was going to be redeemed by Rey to give Rey some sort of purpose, some sort of, all right, now she's driving the plot. This is where she takes control. But it never happened.
Yeah, I mean, redemption arcs for a character are very common, where you have a character who makes a terrible mistake or does something terrible, and then they have to kind of redeem that action, redeem themselves, and prove that they're good. That's a very big staple in most narratives. And in fact, if you look at Game of Thrones again, you have the character of Jaime Lannister, whose entire story for the first 4 or 5 seasons was about redeeming himself, as a character, because he broke his oath, he killed his king, he did this terrible thing that basically shot his honor. Like, he was sapped of his honor from that point on, and he became very cynical because of it. And then throughout the course of his journey, he starts wanting to try to regain his honor by doing the right thing. And then by the end of the show, the 8th season, they just completely throw that out the window, throw that redemption arc out the window. And I feel like the Last Jedi does the same thing, where they throw Luke's redemption arc out the window, because there are ways that you can do this, the story threads in The Last Jedi as they are correctly, get them to work, get them to be consistent, get them to be something that the audience accepts. But the way that they were done didn't do that. And this just comes down to being a skilled writer. This comes down to understanding the fundamentals of how narrative structure works and character arcs work and things of that, where you can sit down and you can kind of take a meta view of your story and realize what you need to do in order to achieve the goals that you as a storyteller are setting out, and also understand that how to get the audience to accept them. And I feel like this is not something that's been done with pretty much any Star Wars movie, maybe with the possibility of Rogue One. But, for the most part, they've just been kind of like doing their own thing and telling the audience, hey, you have to go along with it because these are our movies now. They're not yours.
Right. That's the interesting part about this whole sequel trilogy, is that it seems to have no direction, and it seems to have, they're trying to be doing things on one hand and then failing to set them up with the other. It's kind of like it just seems to ring to me like an amateur, like someone who hasn't had a lot of experience with writing. Like they have an idea of what they want to do, but they don't know how to get there. So they make a story, and they try to contrive the story so that these little plot points or these little elements can be in there. And that's something that happens with the Mary Sue. When you have a Mary Sue plotline with a Mary Sue character driving it, it's I want my Mary Sue-ish character to fall in love with this character somehow. So they don't know how they're going to get there, but they contrive the story so it can eventually lead there. And that's what it seems like what's going on. They're not really seem like they have an idea, like, and it really plays into what you said earlier that Johnson was kind of just riding blind. He had no idea where he was going to go. He might have had an idea of what he wanted to put in there, but he didn't actually have a road mapped out.
Well, Johnson's also like he's not the most skilled of writer. Now, he's written some decent stuff in the past. I liked his movie Brick. I liked his movie Looper. But in terms of, even by his own admission, like, he finds writing to be difficult. And he's not alone in that. But as a storyteller, as a writer, it's not just enough to put pages or words on pages. Like when I was in Hollywood, it was very frustrating trying to be a writer in Hollywood because everyone thinks they can be a writer when you're in Hollywood. Some producer's cousin's brother, has an idea for a script, and he throws some words on a page, and because he's connected to this producer, it gets made, even though it's a piece of crap. And then you have really talented writers who take the time to make brilliant scripts that never see the light of day because there's no money attached to them, or it's too experimental, or what have you. So in Hollywood, it doesn't matter if you study to be a writer. As long as you can get something on the page and you have the right connections to get it made, it's going to get made. There was actually, when I was in the industry, there was this little booklet it was filled with actors. Like each page on the book had a picture and a kind of breakdown of the actors' movies and how much they made, and it would assign a value to these actors. And it would say, if you have this actor in your movie, you're guaranteed to make this much money off the movie. And so if you could combine like 2 or 3 of these actors to a movie, you could guarantee a box office take of X million dollars. Okay. So if you have a script, an unproduced script, and you somehow get like a certain actor attached to the script, that actor is guaranteed to bring in X million amount of dollars. So like, let's just say $10 million for having this actor attached. So you can go to a studio or a producer and be like, hey, here's a script. It's a piece of shit, but we have this actor attached, so it's guaranteed to make at least $10 million. And the producer would be like, love it. Let me take it to the studio. So, and then the studio's like, okay, well, here's $10 million to make your movie. And that's kind of how Hollywood works. So you don't have to be a good writer to get stuff made in Hollywood. And in fact, having good writers work on Hollywood productions is fairly rare. Most of them work in TV because it's steadier work.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the movie stuff, oftentimes the producer or the director is the one in charge of the movies, and they use writers as kind of like paintbrushes, where they'll have like one writer come in and write a rough draft, then they'll have another writer come in and rewrite it, and they'll have another writer come in and work on the dialogue and stuff like that. And before you know it, you had like a half dozen writers on the screenplay, each one changing stuff, and producers putting their ideas in and things like that. And it becomes a hodgepodge where too many cooks spoil the soup type thing. And oftentimes that's the process that winds up getting a script to a screen. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of these movies that you see come out of Hollywood nowadays aren't very good. And
so that's a secret. I always wondered how come all these writers are getting paid all these millions of dollars, all these directors and things, they're getting paid all this money, and a lot of these movies that are coming out are horrible. It's very easy to pinpoint why they're so terrible.
Well, there's also, you have to understand that writers don't have any power.
Mhm.
when they're working on movies. So the main storytelling power lies in either the director or the producer. It depends on who has the bigger name in the making of the movie. So, for instance, to use the DC movies as an example, Zack Snyder was the one who kind of had the ultimate say in what went into like Batman versus Superman, Justice League, stuff like that. And so, like, you could have the best written script in the world, but Zack Snyder comes along. He's like, you know what? I want to have Batman and Superman's mom have the same first name, and they call attention to it right here. And the writer could be like, Zach, that's a terrible idea, but he'd be like, I don't care. It's what I want. Oftentimes, what happens is you have a director who has an idea for a set piece in his mind, like a big, elaborate kind of action scene or iconic, kind of like visually stunning kind of type of scene. Like, for instance, in The Last Jedi, the throne room fight with Kylo and Rey
The
against the
guards and everything.
Praetorian Guard.
Mhm.
So he could say, like, I don't want a traditional lightsaber battle. I want, this red room, and I want Rey and Kylo fighting side by side against, these really badass, like not Sith, but like badass guys with these like weapons and stuff. And everyone could be like, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but he's the director and that's what he wants, so we have to give it to him. So oftentimes you have writers who are often overruled or rewritten or whatever based off of the whims of the director or the producer. And so stories, if you don't have a strong director who kind of has a good sense of narrative and oversees the actual overarching plot and story of the movie carefully, you get a lot of stuff that is just basic narrative errors because you're bringing in all these opinions that might not belong, and you're asking writers to kind of shoehorn them in there. And the writer can't just say no, I don't want to do that because it would ruin the script. Because if he says that, then guess what? He's fired. They'll just bring in another writer to come and do it. So unless you have a screenwriter who has like final say on the script, which is extremely rare,
They have a
like
big name or
extremely,
something.
yeah, the only ones who can actually do that are the writers slash directors, the directors who actually write their own stuff, like Ryan Johnson, like
Mhm.
J.J. Abrams. So they can kind of come in there, and because they're a producer or they're a director, they have the final say of how the script goes. But most writers don't have that luxury. And so you have a lot of people, like the producer comes in and is like, I want my girlfriend to have a scene in this movie. And it's like, well, we don't really have a character for her. He's like, make one up. you know and like, so like you have to like just put in this random scene for the producer's girlfriend. And that's the type of thing that Hollywood screenwriters have to deal with. Now, that's to a less extent that's true in TV, because TV really is a writer's medium, but movies, it's kind of rampant, so it becomes difficult to be a writer. And that's one of the reasons kind of why I left Hollywood behind and became a novelist, is because when you're writing books, you don't have to worry about other people.
You're control the whole thing.
Exactly, it's your vision that goes on there, and you sink or swim based off of that. Like if the book sucks, that's your fault. If the book's really good, that's to your credit. You can't say that with screenplays, and you can't say that with TV shows and stuff like that, because there is a committee aspect to writing those things, and it can be very hard to navigate that, especially if you don't have any power in the production. If you're not a producer, if you're not a director, that type of thing.
I wonder if that might be why television is kind of taking over the entertainment medium. Because you see, like with I know Bret Easton Ellis speaks on this, but he mentions that the movies are kind of emulating television now, and then television is becoming the new what movies used to be. Have you seen the latest Game of Thrones? Have you seen the latest uh, series of unfortunate events? Have you seen the latest X, Y, and Z television show? And
Well, the biggest issue there is movies only have a certain amount of time to tell their story, whereas TV shows, they can take their time. Like, I think one of the most brilliant TV shows ever made was The Wire on HBO.
oh yeah,
It is a beautifully written show, like perfect from beginning to end, in my opinion. Um, and they had 5 seasons of, I think, 13 episodes each, 12 episodes, something like that, to tell this story. And when I first started watching that show, the very first season was incredibly slow, like painstakingly slow. And I almost gave up on watching it. But then there was something, I think 6 episodes in, that clicked for me. And I became enthralled. But it took 5 episodes to set up that turning point. And if you were in a movie, you wouldn't be able to do that because you've only got at max maybe 2.5, 3 hours if you're, super powerful in terms of being a director or a producer. Usually it's, anywhere from 80 minutes to 2 hours is what you have to tell your story in movie form. Whereas with TV, you have the opportunity to tell, especially nowadays with the streaming services, to tell a story over the course of anywhere from 6 to 13 hours, which was previously unheard of because most TV shows had to be episodic in nature. You had to be able to watch the episode within, you know, uh, a single hour, and then the next episode had to be its own thing. Like you couldn't have any kind of connection between the two because people didn't think that people would follow the story because
Right.
they'd have to, run these things in syndication and they would often go out of order. So you couldn't rely on these. At most you could do maybe a 2-part episode that had to be aired back to back. But other than that, you didn't want to put that restriction on it. But nowadays, you can do this kind of long form storytelling in television. I think that that's why you've seen kind of the migration of writers to the TV medium because it is more of a writer's medium than movies.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I think the format, and not just television, but the format has been radiating everywhere else. I mean, you see that, for example, like we mentioned, Marvel, and they spent the last 10 years putting together this entire giant story using their movies, and it's not really this. I mean, that's cool and everything. I mean, it works in that because it was so new and it's not really been done before with such high quality and in a cinematic, the cinema arena. But other than direct sequels and everything. But this isn't. This is more of a universe rather than direct sequels. This kind of all pair into each other, and it's the medium. It's a format of television going to movies. And now that you mentioned that, television has become a writer's area, it's a writer's area. That makes sense because movies have been kind of declining in quality while television has sort of taken over because of quality. Typically speaking, there's a lot of television shows now with talented writers and talented writing behind every single one of them.
Yeah, movies tend to advance based off of their visuals, like
Hmm.
the latest technology with special effects, with cinematography, big name actors, and stuff like that. But the writing has kind of dipped in quality. That's the thing that's made movies suffer is just the fact that the writing's been bad
Right.
for a great number of films. And with television kind of used to be like the redheaded stepchild of the entertainment industry. But nowadays, because the writers have focused so much on television, you get some of the best stories in there, and the production quality is actually starting to match that you can find in the movies. So there's becoming kind of like a blurring line between cinema and television. The only difference is that television is something that you consume within the comfort of your home. Like you can't go to a theater and watch 13 episodes of Daredevil, you know, but you can do it at your own pace from the comfort of your own home. Whereas
Mhm.
with movies, you go out, you don't want to spend more than like 3 hours in a
Right.
movie theater.
3 hours is a
You know,
long time.
yeah. So like most of the time you go out to a movie expecting to be entertained for 2 hours and then go home. And it's actually a lot harder to write a good story within that time limit of 2 hours than it is to write a story over the course of 6 to 10 to 13 hours like you get on TV. So it requires a greater level of skill. And unfortunately, Hollywood doesn't nurture that type of skill. There was a time back in the 80s where Michael Ovitz, the guy who started Creative Artists Agency, CAA,
Mhm.
his big idea was to kind of represent all the writers in town. So he went around, he signed all the big screenwriters, like every screenwriter he could find. And all of a sudden, the studios were like, oh, we can't hire any writers without going through this guy. So basically, he was able to take these writers and package them with directors and stars that he represented and stuff like that. And it was the thing that made his talent agency such a powerhouse in the industry, is because he controlled the writers. And I feel like we got a lot of really good written stuff in the 80s and probably early 90s. Now, that's not to say wasn't bad stuff. I mean, there's always going to be bad stuff, but I think the quality of the stuff that came out in Hollywood from the counterculture era on was pretty good for the most part. And that, I feel like, has kind of fallen off in recent history, probably from the late 90s on,
Mhm.
because writing, either all the good writers moved to TV, or Hollywood just stopped caring about good writers. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's pretty much my experience in Hollywood. I don't mean to come off sounding bitter, but this is just like, this was my experience
But
of
it does
how
make sense. It
how it
does
works.
empirically speaking, it does make sense that yeah, that's true because you see the rise of the television format. I mean, television has become the king almost, or maybe not even almost. I think television has become king and the go-to for entertainment. I mean, you see this with, for example, Game of Thrones. There's so many television style formatted shows now, syndicated shows now, and they all are praised in some way, or most of them, a lot of them are praised in some way because of their writing, their characterization. They know what they're doing in these formats. And I mean, it's not just because it's a television format where you have a lot longer to tell a story, and that does help. But a talented writer can also produce a really good movie if they do everything correctly, which a talented writer could. But as you said, television has become sort of a writer's medium. And if they're migrating over there, all their talent is pooling in television and it's showing because television is overtaking everything else. So
Yeah,
what you're saying is empirically true.
the real talent in movies lies with the director, and that's why it's important to have a director who's a good storyteller. Like, he may not be the writer of the movie, but he understands story. He understands how to tell story. This is one of the reasons why Steven Spielberg has endured for so long, is because, like, he's a director who understands story, and
He,
he's able to
you
get
can
his
understand
writers.
humanity. You can understand humanity really well.
Yeah,
People.
as a director, because like I directed a movie and I studied to be
Mhm.
a director. I went to film school and stuff like that. You have so many responsibilities, and it's very rare to find a director who's not only good with actors, good at managing the production, and good at storytelling. We call these people auteurs. They're the guys who are the full package, right? And Steven Spielberg is probably one of the most famous ones, because even though he's had flops and he's had movies that weren't so good, for the most part, his films have been extremely well done. Not just in terms of visuals, but in terms of the production, in terms of the acting, and in terms of the storytelling. And that's the most important thing, is in movies as a medium, the director has to be a good storyteller. And if you look at someone like Zack Snyder, now I know Zack Snyder has his fans out there, and I'm not trying to diss him, but even though he is a brilliant visualist, like, his visual style is very well done, he is not a good storyteller. If you look at Sucker Punch, which is a movie he actually wrote, it makes no sense whatsoever. It is almost nonsensical. Um, and even the movies that he hasn't written are either very convoluted or not very well told. Now, they look great, but as a story, they fall flat on their face. And that's the difference there, is that, as you know, in a director's medium, you need to have directors who are not just visualists, who are not just good managers, but people who understand how to tell a good story, because they're the ones who are ultimately responsible for that. Whereas in TV, it's not a director's medium. The directors are just kind of there, like, they bring them in as needed to shoot the show. And the real power lies with the executive producer, who's like the head writer, who manages the writer's room. And it's all those other writers that kind of contribute to the show that are responsible for its quality. So you can have a very low budget show, but if the writing's good, people are going to love it. Like look at the Orville, even
Oh
though the
yeah.
or,
Oh
even though
yeah.
the Orville, has, I think it cost them like $2-3 million an episode or something like that. It looks very low budget, but the writing is very solid, and so people are just in love with that show. It's building its own fan base. Then you look at something like Star Trek Discovery, where it's got like what $8 million an episode.
Mhm.
It's very slick. It looks like a feature film, but people don't like it because the writing's not good. So you can have a low budget show that has great writing and it's going to be a hit because people respond. That's what they respond to. And I always like to tell people that the initial wow factor of an action scene or a special effect or a visual only happens once when you first see it. If you remember the first time you saw The Last Jedi and the scene of the Holdo maneuver where she light speed rams, the supremacy, and there's that gorgeous shot of that light speed ramming happen and cutting through like the First Order fleet.
Right.
Like visually, it's amazing.
Looks stunning.
Yeah, but you watch that a second, third, fourth time, and it's just kind of like, I've seen it.
Akbar should have
But
been the one who did that. I mean, that's what the actor said, and I believe him.
yeah, but the story is something that never gets old. Like you can watch The Princess Bride a million times and love it the millionth time as much as you did the first time because the story's there. You can watch Star Wars A New Hope a million times. The story's there. It's never going to, be less enjoyable. But the visuals age. So you can't just rely on visuals to carry a movie. You have to make sure that the core of the movie, the actual story, is the thing that's good. And that's the issue with a lot of movies nowadays is that that core story is not good.
I tend to agree. I mean, it seems to be why the quality of Hollywood has been declining. I mean, the Hollywood seems to be in decline altogether. Just a few franchises kind of holding them up.
Well, throughout the years, everyone, like every year, people say Hollywood's declining. It's been like that since I was a kid. So I think it's just a symptom of, a bigger problem. And
Mhm.
Hollywood goes through these cycles where like they'll make like a bunch of crappy movies and they'll finally learn that the audience, is telling them what they want. So they'll start listening to them again and then it'll cycle back. And Hollywood's all about these cycles. But, in terms of storytelling, like these are the issues that writers have to deal with where they have no power in movies, but they have power in TV.
Mhm.
But they have ultimate power in novels. So the question is whether you're a writer, a director, a producer, whatever. It always comes down to, do you have a good concept of story? Do you understand the principles of storytelling? Do you understand the principles of narrative and character development, stuff like that? And can you explain that to other people and get them to go along with you and produce a good story? So, I mean, that's kind of what my articles have always been about. That's kind of been when I'm on Twitter and tweeting about stuff, that's kind of what I focus on. And I think that it's something that more people need to learn about, and not a lot of people are interested in, unfortunately.
Right. It is unfortunate. I mean, but that's what I like to do. I like to dive into these things, look into characterization, why things work, why things don't. And you seem to have the same interest, and I think that's important. Is get aspiring writers to think a little bit on their own, just try new things and see why things work and why some things don't. But right at the moment, it's about we're at the 2 hours and 20 minute mark. I said we'll be at 2 hours max. So I think it'll be at this point be a good time to close out. Do you have anything other to shill or do a little spew out some sort of advertisement if you want to tell anyone out there in the audience about?
Well, if you guys would like to follow me on Twitter, I'm always up for getting new followers. It's at Matthew Kadish, Kadish. You can also get my first book if you want to see if I have my money where my mouth is, if I'm, a decent writer or not. You can get my first book for free. I kind of have my own version of Star Wars out there. It's called the Earthman Jack Space Saga. It's just kind of like, meant to take all the science fiction I grew up loving in the 80s and early 90s and kind of mush it all up in a ball and say, what would this story be like if Steven Spielberg directed it? And that's the Earthman Jack saga. So if you go to earthmanjack.com, you sign up for my newsletter, you get the ebook version of my first book for free. And if you want to go to Kadish Books, Kadish books.com, it goes to my Amazon author page, and you can see all the books I've written there. If you want to check out, what they're about, read the reviews. I think we've got over 400 5-star reviews for the first Earthman Jack book, so a lot of people really seem to like it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I just tweet my inane thoughts all day in between bouts of writing new books. So
I do believe everything mentioned here is in the description of this video. Twitter, the book that you can download for free, and if you want to take a look, everything should be in the description of this video.
Oh, and I also have my Medium articles, which you've been referencing here. It's medium.com/@MatthewKadish, and you can find all my articles on there. I do these Storycraft articles where we talk about the actual story elements, and then I do like some reviews and some responses to other people's articles and things like that.
I do recommend checking them out. They are very well written and very well thought out. I enjoyed reading the article I did read. It's very interesting, very thought-provoking. I did learn a few things too. All right, so that's everything. I'll go ahead and close out here. Thank you, Matthew, again for joining me. It was a pleasure. And thank you.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for coming out. And hope you all have a great night.